Hello, everyone, and after a long hiatus, welcome back to Israel Matters. I am Rabbi Pesach Wolicki, and with me, as always, and once again, is my dear friend, uh, security analyst, tour guide, military expert, you name it, Elliot Chodoff. How you doing, Elliot?
I'm good. How are you, Pesach?
I'm doing very well, thank God. It's been a very, very busy time in life. I have a wedding of one of my daughters coming up.
Congratulations,
We
Mazal
just
Tov.
celebrated a bat mitzvah of my youngest daughter, so things are busy. How are things up in Ashgar?
Good. I feel my democracy is stronger because I exercised it today.
Which is why we're here.
Yes,
As everyone saw when you clicked on this video, the title of this is How Israeli Elections Work. And that's what we're going to do in this video today. We're each going to take a part of this. I'm going to start, if you don't mind, Elliot.
not at all.
Okay. Besides voting today, as you did, and I have been in a volunteer way a part of the election process from the administrative side, all the way through the counting of votes and the certifying of votes.
Wow.
It's due to some people that I know who asked me to fill this role a few election cycles back. This time they had enough people locally and they didn't need me, but I was contacted. I told them I was available. But I've been through the whole process from the side of the people managing a ballot station and counting the votes and how the process works. So what I'm going to do,
I've never seen that.
oh, it's fascinating. And it was especially fascinating to me, I'll say just again, my last sentence of introduction, in watching all of the discussion around the controversies of election integrity and how ballots are counted in the United States in the November 2020 election, my mind kept going back to what we do here because I know it intimately. So I'd like to just lay that out over the course of the next few minutes, just talk about from when someone walks into the station to vote until the votes are counted at the end of the day, just how the process works from a technical perspective. And then I'm going to turn it over to you, Elliot, and you're going to discuss what happens next. How does the electoral system work? Because there's a lot of confusion Americans have because of how different our system is. So you'll go through that whole process. So here's the way it works. In Israel, we have only election day. There's really no way to vote early or to vote late. Everyone votes on election day. There are only what we would call absentee ballots or mail-in ballots only for people working in the diplomatic corps, Israelis who have also sort of NGO, but somehow government related jobs outside of Israel. There are many Israelis, for instance, who serve roles in diaspora Jewish communities on behalf of the state of Israel that are kind of nonprofit, but are connected. People in positions like that can vote. It's very carefully guarded who can do this. And those are really the only people whose votes get sent in through some sort of mail processing system. Everyone else just votes.
They have to vote in consulates and embassies.
Right. Oh, yeah. It's a very carefully guarded process. Let's just say that, and that's how they vote. Soldiers who are on army bases vote on their army base, but their vote in a municipal election, they even vote in a municipal election on their army base. And those votes also sometimes take some time to come in because they get credited not to the army base, but to the city or the precinct, as it were. Very similar system in terms of precincts to what you have in the States. So that'll be easy to explain. It'll get credited to there. So for example, my son, who happens to be doing reserve duty today, he has a 2-day reserve duty. He was discharged from the Army last year, but he's voting on an Army base today because he happens to be there today. He couldn't vote early. That vote will get transferred back to our town and counted among the votes of our city because that's where he lives. So I live in the city of Beit Shemesh. He is a Beit Shemesh voter. Okay, that's just how it works in terms of counting the votes. But let's go through the process. So what happens is Elliot Chodoff wakes up in the morning. He takes he has to have a photo ID with him. That could either be a driver's license, a passport, or what a national ID card. Israel has national ID cards that everyone gets from the age of 16 that have all the basic information on them. So you don't need to have a driver's license. You don't need to have a passport because everyone's going to have one of these national ID cards. And without a photo ID, there is no way anyone is ever going to vote. There's no chance in the world
And
that someone's going to vote.
May I add, even in a small community like mine, where everybody knows everybody, when I went in and everybody on the board sitting there knows me, I had to give my ID and take off my mask to show them my face.
Absolutely. Right. Right. Well, there was probably also someone in the room who you didn't know. There probably
Yes.
was one person there. Right.
Yes, but the point is that in this small community where everybody knows everybody, there's still no slack of, okay, I know you, pass.
That's a very good point, because that's not something I would have thought to say, because I live in, for Israeli standards, a busy city that has a lot of different population groups. And I when I served as a polling station manager, I didn't know almost anybody who came into that polling station. I knew a few people, a few faces I recognized. That's an interesting point. Now, I mentioned that there would have had to be one person in the room who didn't know you. Now, why did I say that? This is another very important feature of Israeli elections, that the staff in a polling station will never be only locals. Now, most of the staff, everyone but one in every polling station, will be local people. They're volunteers, or sometimes they're college students who took a one-day course, from the Interior Ministry to help out. But everyone in the polling station, other than one person, will be locals, and there will always be one person who represents the Interior Ministry who is there, who specifically is not from the community and does not reveal their party affiliation. No one, this is a person who comes in from the outside, and that's in order to make sure that a local community isn't playing games with their votes.
No cronyism.
Exactly. So there will be someone, and that's why I said, like, when you said, oh, everyone there knows me, there's no way. There has to be one.
Right.
There's going to be
you're
one
right.
person in the room who's not from your town and has no
Correct.
real connection to your town. Okay. So here's what happens. Elliot Chodoff walks into the polling station and he shows his ID card. Now, when he shows his ID card,
hands them.
Well, I'm sorry, you have to hand it to them. They'll hold it. They'll look at you. They'll make sure it's the same person. Then here's what they do. They will have a booklet. And this isn't done on a computer. Everything is done by hand. You will not see a computer in the room. Everything's done by hand. He will have a printed, what looks like a pad of paper that's printed, and it will have the names of every eligible voter who's voting in that precinct. Now, for a town like yours, there's probably just everyone's voting in one place and it's just one little town.
Correct.
In a town like mine that's busier, let me describe what happened. So I went down to a local school, and I went into the school, and there were about 6 classrooms on the ground floor of the school that were each one of the precincts. Now, the precincts are very small. The people who live in the building next to me, I live in like a townhouse complex with multi-story homes that are kind of all built into these connected buildings. There was someone in the building next to me who was voting in a different precinct. The precincts can be just a few hundred voters, 400 or 500 voters in a precinct, very small. So they really subdivided into very, very small balloting stations. So again, in this one school, there were about 6 of these balloting stations, and that's just for my neighborhood. So we walk into the building, we find the right room, we go in, I gave my ID card, they look at the ID card, and then they pull out this printed stapled book that has the names and ID numbers and address of every single person who's in that balloting station. In that, we'll call it a precinct for ease of understanding. When they find my name in the list, the person who took my ID card, who finds my name in the list, then calls out what number voter I am. I think I was number 405 in my list. He calls out the voter number. The reason he calls it out is that there are 2 copies of this book, always. There is not one copy. There are always 2 copies, and 2 different people in the room at 2 different tables have the book in front of them. Okay. He calls out the name and he strikes a line through the name to say that I am voting. And the other person who has the other book also strikes a line through my name to say that I am voting. Okay. Now he does that when he hands me an envelope. Okay. So now let me talk about the people in the room now, because I've just mentioned there's different people in the room. The people in the room are placed there. They're not just random volunteers. They also represent the political parties that have an interest in that particular precinct. Now, you might think that every political party has an interest in every precinct. Not really. I mean, theoretically they do, but they don't really, because what type of people live in a certain area is going to influence what people are concerned with. So, for example, in a lot of the Arab towns, Arab Israeli towns, some of the non-Arab parties that are concerned with election integrity for that town will make sure to send some of their volunteers to volunteer to be poll workers in those polling stations, and they will be there as observers. Now, according to Israeli law, any registered political party can have an observer in any polling station they want there all day long. Now, so you might be in a polling station where there's a table with 4 or 5 people just sitting there watching the action, and they're as close to the action as any of the poll workers. They can ask the person who took your ID card if they could look at the ID card. Meaning they can say, hey, let me take a look at that ID card. Now, if they do that every time, they're going to just irritate people, but they can question anything. They can look at anything at any moment. They can call out anything. And if there's a real complaint, that complaint gets registered. There is a law enforcement officer at the front door of every polling station, and that person can be called in if there's a suspicion of fraud. I once caught someone committing election fraud, and I'll get to how that happened. So the people who are working the tables also are representative of different parties. Okay, so they're there. So this person calls out the name. He strikes the name off the list. The other person strikes it in their book also, and those books are always kept separate. There can never be only one poll worker in the room at any time from the morning till the end of the day. There always have to be multiple people in the room so that no one's ever left alone. Okay, the person who took my ID card and struck my name off the list hands me an envelope. Now I'm going to share my screen for a moment just to show you what this envelope looks like. And here we go. So this is what the envelope looks like. Okay, now let's take a look at this envelope very carefully. You'll notice that it has signatures in the bottom corner here. Now these signatures are actually handwritten signatures. Every single one of these envelopes, before they open the polling station in the morning, the person from the Interior Ministry who's managing the polling station has to sign all of these envelopes, plus one of the local people who's been assigned to manage the polling station with him. So that's where there's 2 signatures. Those were signed that morning. They could not have been pre-signed, meaning when they take them out of the box in the morning, if they're already signed, they're invalid. And that's why it's always 2 people. The other person is going to say, hey, those are signed already. They're signed on the spot by the poll station manager who's going to be there all day long. Okay? If an envelope doesn't have that signature on it, it's not going to be valid later. This signature here is not a real signature. This is a printed signature that just shows that this is this election cycle's envelopes. Okay, so it's printed on there by the person on the national level who approved of this election. So it can't be some old envelope, or very hard to forge this. No one knows exactly what the signature is going to look like until it comes out that day. So this is the envelope they hand you. They hand you an envelope. Now, in the background of this picture, you'll also see this this case that has all these little pieces of paper in them with letters on them. What happens in an Israeli election is you don't have a list of different offices you're voting for like you have in the States. There's nothing down ballot. There isn't even the name of the person you want as your prime minister. What you have on these
actually, some of them do.
Some of them do. They'll have a name. The parties can write what they want. Let's take a look at one of those right now. Hold on a second. Let me just get it.
I borrowed a few when I voted today.
Yeah, here's a good picture. Here we go. So here's a picture. While I'm sharing my screen, I figured I'd just throw it up here.
Right.
This is me holding the piece of paper that I put in. I took a picture of this. This is a Likud piece of paper. Now, every party has letters that are just letters that they choose, and they have to get approved by the Interior Ministry that no one else is using them already. And those become the letters that represent their party. The reason this was done originally in Israel's history was that a lot of the immigrants coming in didn't know Hebrew, and they didn't want it to have to be words that have to be read. So this way they could just advertise to people, our party is letter Aleph, our party is letter Bet, our party is letter Gimel. And the first elections in Israel, it really was just single letters. And then with time, different parties formed, parties merged. In fact, the reason that the Likud is 3 letters is because the Likud party way back decades ago was actually a blend of 3 parties, and they took all 3 letters and they put them there. That's why there's 3 letters. This isn't a word. It's just 3 letters that represent the Likud party led by Benjamin Netanyahu. And that's what it says down here in this text. It says the Likud party led by Netanyahu, but it's not necessary to say that. This is a valid piece of paper. And these pieces of paper are in this big tray. And as you see, there's some other parties, and there's dozens of them. There's parties that even I, as a politically well-informed Israeli, have never heard of. There's people make
and we'll never hear of again.
And we'll never hear of again. Why these people create these political parties and run, no one has any idea. Now you'll notice in this picture, there's also one cell here that has blank pieces of paper. It is an option. If someone wants to log a protest vote, the way to do it is to put a blank piece of paper in the envelope. Now, let me explain something. If your person does not put a blank piece of paper in and just leaves the envelope blank, leaves the envelope empty, when the votes get counted, which I'll get to in a moment, it will not be counted as a protest vote. It won't go into the official numbers that there were X number of blank votes that were a protest vote. That envelope will simply be discarded as invalid. So there's a difference between an invalid vote and a valid vote for nobody, which is a protest vote. And that's why we have these blank pieces of paper here. Okay, so that's an option as well. So everyone takes the piece of paper that they're voting for, they put it into the envelope. They put it into the envelope that we just showed. And this is all behind, you go behind this screen, you're by yourself in there, that's the polling booth. You take the piece of paper, you put it in the envelope that had been given to you by the polling station manager. You seal the envelope. You then come back around. I'm going to stop the screen share now. You then come back around outside of the booth and put it into a box with a slot in the top of it. At that point, the polling station manager hands you back your ID card that he has been holding on to while you're voting, and you leave. Okay, that's what happens. That's how you vote. Now, Elliot will explain how this works, where you're not voting for anything else. You're just voting for a party. Very different than the United States. And that's where a lot of the confusion that outsiders have about what happens in our elections begins from. But again, I'll leave that for Elliot to describe. So that's how everyone votes. There's nothing computerized. It's all paper. And the polling station stays open until I think 10 p.m. is the time that they officially close the polls here. Now, when the polls close, here's what happens. Every party, and again, there's dozens of parties, and the vast majority of them don't show up. Usually 4 or 5 parties are represented in the room, but any political party that has an interest in that ballot station can send someone to join the counting team. But that person has to be registered. They have to know in advance. You have to have your name on a list. So let's say the first time I ever did this, I wasn't a poll station manager. I was on a counting team. I show up. I say, I'm representing the Likud party on the counting of this particular polling station. They check to make sure that I was approved in advance, that I am who I say I am. I show my ID card again, and I'm allowed in the room. The people who are observing the counting are in the room. The polling station manager from the Interior Ministry, who's been there since the morning, is still there. They're putting in a long day. And this is at 10 p.m. after we've closed the polls. Okay, and usually we start immediately. because they just want to get it done and get the counting done. So doors closed, the people in the room are going to be observing the count. And it's usually a classroom in a school. You get all, get the classroom tables, everyone kind of sits in a circle. And then here's what happens. We don't just open the box and start counting. The first thing that happens is we take out those two pads, those two polling books, and two different people. It could be the volunteers. Usually it's not the person who was marking them. They give it to someone else. And each book is counted separately how many names were crossed off. The short way to do that is, because Israel usually has high voter turnouts, is what we do. The quick way to do it is you look at the bottom number of the last voter. Let's say there's 500 voters in the precinct. And then we go through the book and count how many names weren't crossed off. Either way, the two books get counted and that number has to be identical. The number of names crossed off in the two books must be identical. If it's not identical, a report is filled out that gets attached to this polling station that there is a flaw in this polling station because the number was not identical. We then go on with the count anyway, but that means that this is a questionable polling station. I've been involved in these counts, I think 4 or 5 times. I've never seen it not come out identical, by the way. In the times, this isn't a large sample size, but those two books have to be identical. Because again, you could see where, if there was only one book, you could see where fraud could happen. The person who's marking the book maybe gets up and goes to the bathroom. Someone else sitting there or sitting next to them just crosses off a name, takes an envelope, and at some point in the day drops it in. But again, it's very difficult because there's multiple people in the room at all times. Okay. So we've checked the two books. The two books are identical. And we also know exactly how many envelopes there should be in the box because we've counted how many voters voted. So let's say 450 out of the 500 voters voted. There's 50 lines that weren't crossed off. We know that we need to find 450 envelopes in the box. We then unlock the box. The box has a padlock on it. We unlock the box, open it up, dump out all the envelopes. We're not opening them yet. We are counting the envelopes closed. The sealed envelopes get counted, and there must be the same number as the number of names crossed off. Everyone in the room is watching. Again, everyone, the representatives of all these parties, these volunteers are all sitting there watching, and everyone has a piece of paper and a pen, and everyone's taking notes. We count up the envelopes. There's 450 envelopes. We're good to go. At this point, one person, again, generally it is the manager of the polling station, will open up these envelopes by hand, one by one. It takes a long time. But again, it's not that many votes. It's a few hundred votes. He opens up an envelope. He shows the inside of the envelope and pulls out the piece of paper. Now, why does he do that? To make sure that there's nothing else in the envelope besides one slip of paper. This means, and let me explain how strict we are. Let's say someone wanted to vote for this party. This is the Labor Party, okay? Let's say someone wanted to vote for the Labor Party. And by mistake, 2 pieces of paper came out. They're thin little pieces of paper, and they came out 2 together. Even if they're 2 beautiful, pristine pieces of paper together in the envelope, that is an invalid vote. It's not a vote for the Labor Party. It is marked invalid because there were 2 pieces of paper in there. If this piece of paper has pen marks on it, it has something written on it, it's ripped, it is an invalid vote. And there's no disputes here. There's no bending of the rules. It is an invalid vote. Okay? It's extremely strict. So we open up the envelopes, we take out, so the station manager, the polling station manager opens up the envelope, he takes out the vote, and he holds it up and shows it to everyone in the room and says, Labor Party. Everyone in the room has on their piece of paper, they have different names of parties, and they write next to it 1, and they're marking it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The way when we count with lines with the 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you cross the 5, right? Everyone does that. But here, everyone's actually instructed to do that. And the reason they're instructed to do that is that when a fifth vote or 10th or 15th or 20th or 25th on the fives for each party gets mentioned. So let's say he pulls it out, he says Labor, he pulls out another one, Likud, he pulls out another one, Likud. When he gets to the fifth Likud vote and says Likud, someone in the room, usually a bunch of people do it at the same time, will say, that's a 5. Or in Hebrew, they'll just say soger, which means I'm closing a 5. And someone might say, wait a second, I only had 4, right? I didn't have 5. If anyone objects, we take all the votes from that party that have been voted, that have been counted already, and recount them on the spot to make sure that everyone's got the same number. Okay? And so the person who's doing the counting usually has this prop, which is this plank of wood, this little just a strip of wood that has nails sticking up on it, and will stack them. Will stack the counted votes by party, so that at any point, if anyone has a question of how many votes there were for a certain party and says, wait a second, you're saying that's the 20th vote for Labor, I have 19. At that point, they will pick them up and recount them in front of everyone to make sure that there were 20. Okay, that's the way the process works. It's extremely transparent. At the end of it, everyone has, everyone's been keeping score, how many votes for each party have been done in this particular ballot station. Everyone's in agreement. The agreed upon number gets written into an official report book and is shown to everyone in the room. And then the votes, and then the actual physical paper votes are wrapped up in rubber bands and special envelopes that are provided by the Interior Ministry. Everything is packaged up with everyone watching every step of it and locked again in a box. And that report of how many votes came in is phoned in to the Interior Ministry with everyone witnessing the phone call. Okay, that's when the counting is over. That's how the counting process happens here in Israel. I just thought this was, especially with everything going on in America, I thought it was interesting for people to know. Everything is absolutely done by hand and paper from start to finish. Over to you, Elliot. What happens next?
Okay, so first of all, which means that nobody can electronically sneak in and fiddle with anything.
Right.
And you've got a paper trail, literally, to go back on.
100%.
To check.
Right. Oh, there's 2 things I forgot to mention. First of all, I mentioned I caught someone cheating. How does that happen? So that actually happened in a municipal election here. Municipal elections are held in Israel every 5 years. And I was involved in a few of those too. In fact, I have a brother who's a city councilman here in Beit Shemesh as part of the Likud party. Likud party, sort of our family.
Thanks to you being one of the counting.
But so I was working at a polling station here in Beit Shemesh, and someone came in and the ID card was not them. Like the photo ID, see, the person in the photo ID, they had tried to alter their appearance to vote on behalf of someone who was probably out of town or something. Because if someone's abroad, if someone's in Israel on vacation or on a business trip, they cannot vote. I've missed elections for being away. It happens. There's no way. In Israel, you have to vote in person. And by the way, many Israeli citizens who live in the States will plan family visits to come back to Israel and visit their family around elections in order to be able to vote in the elections here in Israel. I did that myself. I lived in the States for 5 years. After I had moved to Israel already, I went back to work as a rabbi in the States. And during that time, there was an election. And I was planning to come back and visit anyway. I planned it around election time, and I was able to vote. So I caught someone who was trying to vote. Most illegal votes in Israel happen for 2 reasons: either because of people disguising themselves, and I hate to say it, this often happens in the ultra-Orthodox Haredi community, where to outsiders they look very similar to each other, and they feel that they can trick people. So if someone's away or maybe recently deceased and or something like that, they'll find someone to dress up like the person. And that was the situation that I caught. Another type of election fraud that does happen in Israel, will happen in towns like yours, in small towns where maybe nobody showed up from, or there weren't enough observers from outside, and they play games there, even though there
Right.
should be oversight. The oversight wasn't very good. And this will happen. It'll sometimes happen in towns that are remote and that kind of, have their own mafia style political leadership internally. So there's some of that going on. But
That'll happen, is more likely to happen in towns that are politically monolithic.
correct.
I mentioned, and not to defend where I live, but we're extremely diverse. As a matter of fact, historically, the voting statistics of Eshkar, where I live, are virtually identical to the national statistics.
Oh, that's quite diverse. Okay. Anyway, so yeah, I just wanted to mention that. So that's what happens. And then, and by the way, the results in Israeli elections come in very, very quickly because the precincts are so small. This process I told you about, usually you're done by about 1 a.m. Okay, which means, and the polls close at 10, you get started a few minutes later. It takes a few hours, but it's only a few hundred votes. By the way, no one's allowed to leave the room during this process. If there's a break, if a break is going to be taken, everyone has to agree to it, and multiple people from multiple parties stay with everything to guard it. I mean, there was discussions after the American election about chain of custody. I promise you, there are no chain of custody issues.
Right.
In the Israeli election. It's really, really carefully watched. So by the time, as the night goes on, the results come in. You, who've never been involved in this process, Ellie, what you're used to is you turn on the news, and starting by about midnight, they're already bringing in real-time results.
Yes.
And they're coming in fast. And by the time you wake up the next morning, every vote has been submitted and counted. It's a small country. All right, so
okay,
Elliot, you pick it up from here and talk about what happens after an election.
So if what you've described, Pesach, is different from the United States experience, now we're going to go completely away, different from the American experience. The Israeli system, unlike the American, is a proportional system. Now, you mentioned that we only vote for a party, and I also collected some of the party slips, just, souvenir of democracy. Each party gets each vote is for a party. In the American system, let me start with the contrast. In the American system, there's a winner-take-all system. In other words, no matter how many people run, there's one winner and everybody else loses. Now, in some localities, you need, I'm thinking the Georgia Senate races, you need more than 50% of the vote to win. So if there are multiple candidates and you don't get 50% of the vote, there has to be a runoff. Yeah. But ultimately, there's only one winner. And you raised a question before that I think this is part of the answer. Why are there all of these small parties? Well, look, if you can't get 50% plus in an election in the United States, there's no point in setting up a small party that's only going to hope to garnish 5% of the vote. 5% is lethal in America.
Well, or let's say even more, down to brass tacks. In the United States, it's a winner-take-all system also locally.
Everything.
So if there's a state, if there's a state that is a blue state that is overwhelmingly blue, the Republican Party won't put any resources into that
right, because the battles there are in the primaries.
Because whatever votes there are for the Republican Party in that state are not counted towards any national total that has any real impact. It only has an impact in a public relations way, winning the popular vote, but it doesn't actually produce results. As opposed to in Israel, if in Eshkar there was one person who voted for a certain party, that vote isn't lost. That vote goes into the national total.
Right. So it may or may not be lost, but let's say for our purposes, let's start with the idea that rather than a winner-take-all, this is a proportional system. Now, I'm not going to go into the threshold because that's going to confuse the issues, but there is a threshold. You have to get a certain percentage in order to get in. Ignore that for the moment. There are 120 seats in the Knesset, in the parliament, and that means that each seat is worth 0.83% of the vote. 1/120th.
Okay.
Okay. Now, what that means is that if you can get 1%, you've got a seat. Again, ignore the actual threshold point.
Right.
Or to put it more accurately, an extra 1% gives you an extra seat. So if you got 6% as opposed to 7%, as opposed to 8%, you get a different number of seats in the parliament. Because what happens is at the end of the process that you just described, the total number of votes cast is tabulated, whatever that number is. And then each party's total is matched to that number as a percentage. So if a party got 10% of the vote, it gets 12 seats. If it gets 20% of the vote, it gets 24 seats, and so on. And going down in the other direction, if it gets 5% of the vote, it gets 6 seats. Now, what that means is, to your remark, is that, you know what, a party could reasonably, a group of people can get together and reasonably hope, most of the time they're wrong, but that doesn't matter, reasonably hope to get 3, 4, 5% of the vote. A little bit of optimism, a little bit of, hope for a miracle. 5% is not that huge a percentage to sort of imagine you can get. That's number one. Number two, the American system is a two-party system, not by law, but by process. Since the number of parties in America, or the number of candidates, dictate the number of losers, not the number of winners. The more candidates, the more losers. And therefore, if you have, for example, and I don't want to go into American politics here, if you have a party split because a particular leader of a party, without mentioning any names, decides that they want to go off and set up their own party in contrast to the traditional one, what that's basically going to do is guarantee a victory of the other side, because it's going to split the vote and they're going to lose. So the tendency is, and has been throughout history, American history, is to resolve conflicts within the party rather than go out and form a new one. In Israel, that's not the case, because ultimately, if I can get through a breakaway, I can pick up 5, 6, 7, 8, 10% of the vote, I'll have my seats. Okay, now, at the end of that process, and there's also all sorts of tweaking at the end that I'm not going to go into here. What about the votes? What are the extra votes? In other words, you don't get the exact number. You get 10 seats, but you have an extra 100,000 votes. What happens to them? Let's leave that. At the end of a procedure, all 120 seats are allocated to the parties.
Based on approximations of the proportions.
Yes, but they're very close approximations.
Yeah. Yeah,
In other words,
there's a whole staged process here.
Exactly, but
first,
the tweaking is
first
a
they count the
seat here,
total number, then they eliminate the parties that didn't get in, and then they redivide it.
That's what I didn't want to go into in detail, but it basically is a difference of a seat up, a seat down.
Yeah, but just to get the whole concept generally, I just want to put this into use like a strange American metaphor so people get their heads around it. If this was the United States, imagine if on November 3rd, 2020, instead of voting the whole slate that you voted, I mean, let's forget about the state legislatures. Right. So let's just think about Washington, D.C. If instead of voting for senators, congressmen, and the president, if you were just voting either Republican, Democrat, or Libertarian,
right?
Okay, so you had one piece of paper that said the Republican Party led by Donald Trump, and you had another piece of paper that said the Democratic Party led by Joe Biden, and you had a third piece of paper that said the Libertarian Party led by Jorgensen. Jorgensen got 1% of the vote or something, or a couple percent of the vote. Whatever the percentage that they got, that the let's say let's say Jorgensen got 2% of the vote, and there's 438 seats in the House of
435.
Representatives. 435? 435 seats in the House of Representatives. That would mean that the Libertarians would have been allotted something like four or five seats, and they would have those seats.
Right. So let's accept that it doesn't work that way.
Right.
Okay. Because we're talking about two different systems. It's not just proportional. And I'll come to that in a moment. Let me just say that the advantage, disadvantage of each system is that the American system is much more stable and the Israeli system is much more representative. Okay. Now, which is better? That's a whole different discussion. Maybe we'll do a different talk on that. But that's the essential difference in sort of overall structure between the two. But now we go to the next phase. And I imagine friends of yours, American friends of yours, have been asking you this for the past few weeks. And I know because friends of mine have, what's the outcome going to be? And my answer has been, I don't know what yours has been, is, are you kidding me? First of all, it's way too close to call, but you've also got this spread of, again, 2-3% one way or the other changes the
whole map.
Yeah,
okay? I mean, what I'm going to be getting, and you'll be getting it tomorrow as well.
Who won?
I guess if people didn't watch this video, are what people say, who won?
Who won? Okay,
and that's not an answerable question.
No, because now the fun begins.
Right.
Okay. Unlike the American system, in which the executive, meaning the president, is elected in a separate election, and the legislature has its own election, and different varying times of the House and the Senate and that sort of thing. But you vote for the legislature in one ballot, and you vote the executive on another ballot. In a parliamentary system like ours, the executive is elected by the legislature. In other words, the prime minister and the government will be elected by the Knesset, not by direct vote of the population.
Right. That's an important point you're making, Elliot. So just, in other words, everything I described, the pieces of paper in the envelope, you're only voting for the proportional representation of a particular party in the Knesset. That's all that's determined.
Right.
And then, as you say,
now in order to seat a government, you have to have a majority of the Knesset, which is 61 seats. Now, the easiest way to do it, which has never happened in Israel's history, is to simply win 61 seats in the election. Never happened. And it's getting worse, not better. Okay, which means that you have to form a coalition. In other words, bring parties together under an agreement to get to that magic 61. Now, the law, as opposed to traditions, the law assigns the job to the president of Israel to choose the member of Knesset who the president believes has the highest likelihood of forming a government. It does not have to be the head of a party. It does not have to be part of the largest party. Before the Knesset, and those are two traditions, but they are not the law.
But in practice,
I said it's tradition.
Right. In practice, the president, and of course the president is, just to make clear, just in case anyone doesn't know, the president in Israel is largely a ceremonial type position who is not really part of the government.
This is one of the true authorities
that he has. Correct.
That he has. Now, before assigning that position or assigning that the option, the ability to form a government, the president meets with representatives of all of the parties. And after the preliminary, what would you like to drink and how's the family? The president basically asks them two key questions. Who will you sit with? I'm sorry, three questions. Who do you recommend? who will you sit with in a government, and who won't you sit with in a government? Okay, I mean, obviously the discussion is more elaborate than that, but those are the three key questions. What is your recommendation? In other words, who should I give what's called the mandate to form the government? Two, who are you willing to sit with in a government? And three, who are you totally unwilling to sit with in a government? And he collates all of that information and comes to the decision to go to Knesset member X and say, call them in and say, I charge you with the formation of government. And then the negotiations begin, which we'll see down the road. Hardball politics, not always obvious. Keep in mind, and this is another one of the quirks of the system, 59 is not 61. And if you have a group of 59 seats, and there's a party with 2 seats, they become kingmaker.
Absolutely.
And
there's a lot of drama.
That's right.
What we should do, Elliot, now that, in resuming the Israel Matters videos,
maybe
now that
pick this up in a week or two.
Is that we'll give regular updates about how
Yes.
this is going as we explain the process.
Right.
Now, we should point out that most of the elections in Israel's history, the giving of the mandate to someone to form a government by the president is a formality because it's a foregone conclusion, because you'll have one party that is so obviously
overwhelmingly powerful.
That was overwhelmingly powerful. It's the leader of the party that got the most seats. But right. in the previous election, where you had the party led by Benny Gantz and Netanyahu's party, it was actually not so clear who should get the mandate, and it went kind of back and forth.
That was true in the 80s too.
Yes, it was. Right, and they ended up forming a unity government,
rotations and unity governments, and all sorts of things.
Shamir and Peres, yeah, there was a lot. There were issues then, but could you explain what happened? So, how long does the mandate last? What happens?
They get 3 weeks, and they can request an additional extension. If that person fails to form a government, the president can give it to somebody else. That's also happened. The Knesset can dissolve itself.
That's also happened.
That has also happened. In other words, there are all sorts of variants here that I think we should leave, because I think we're also running a little long on this.
Sure.
I think we've answered basically what's going to be happening over the next few days. Right. And what I would suggest is next time, maybe pick this up with the much better knowledge of answering the who won and who lost will be much more digestible, let's say.
Right.
A week from now, we won't know who's going to be the ultimate winner, but we'll know who the winners and losers of today
for sure. For sure. And maybe what we'll also discuss then is this is also a bit of a paradigm shift from the United States, that the whole idea that cabinet ministers are also members of the legislature. Yes. That's something that we have to discuss.
We'll talk about the rule by government by cabinet as opposed to government by chief executive.
Absolutely. All right, this is wonderful. I hope this was helpful. Please share this. So many people have questions about the Israeli elections. If you have friends and they're just interested, or just put it on your Facebook page and say, hey, this is how Israeli elections work. Or if you're an election integrity zealot and you want to share with people, this is how they do it in Israel.
That's right.
There's not a lot of things that people praise the Israeli political system for, but but I think our election integrity is excellent. And I think from that perspective, Israel's a very healthy country. So, thank you for watching. Please share this around. We're going to get up and running again. For those of you who've stuck with us, thank you for still being there, and spread the word about Israel Matters. God bless.